This is the nervous system lecture 2, and this is going to be focused on the central nervous system, which comprises of brain and spinal cord. So the lecture 2 will focus majorly on the brain. The central nervous system, as discussed earlier, made up of brain and spinal cord, and this brain and spinal cord are surrounded by three layers of membranes called the meninges. So we are going to discuss the meninges that cover the brain and spinal cord before we now discuss the brain. Meninges. Meninges is a system of membranes which envelop the brain and spinal cord, and they are three layers, which are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And these meninges, they lie between the skull and the brain, and between the vertebral foramina and the spinal cord. The primary function of meninges is to protect the central nervous system. And these three layers, the dura, arachnoid, and pia, there's a space between them because these layers they lie over each other. So there is a space between the dura and arachnoid matter called the subdural space, and there is a space between the arachnoid and the pia matter, which is called the subarachnoid space. This subarachnoid space that is found between the arachnoid and the pia matter contain the cerebrospinal fluid. The first layer of the meninges we'll be discussing is the dura mater, which is also rarely called meninx fibrosa or pachymeninx. It's a thick, durable membrane closest to the skull. It consists of two layers. The layers are the periosteal or outer layer and the inner or meningeal layer. The outer layer is the layer of the dura that's very close to the skull or the cavernea, and the inner layer lie closer to the brain. The structure of the dura mater: between the two layers of the dura mater, there is a potential space between them, except where the dura mater sweep inward between the cerebral hemisphere to form the falx cerebri, and also between the cerebrum and cerebelli to form the tentorium cerebelli. Which means the two layers, both the outer and inner layer, there is a space between them, except where there is no space between the dura mater is where the dura mater sweep inward between the cerebral hemisphere. At this point, the dura mater form the falx cerebri, and also between the junction where the cerebrum and cerebellum also connect, join to each other, there is also a dura mater that also sweep inward between the two structure. And this dura mater in that two region is called the tentorium cerebelli. And this epidural space, which is the space between the two layers of dura mater, are found between the spinal dura mater and walls of vertebral canal, and they contain loose connective and adipose tissue. Dura mater contain larger blood vessels which split into capillaries in the pia mater, and it composes of dense fibrous tissue, and its inner surface is covered by flattened cells like those present on surface of pia and arachnoid matter. So the dura mater is a sac which envelopes the arachnoid and has been modified to serve several functions. So the dura mater surrounds and supports the large venous channel carrying blood from the brain towards the heart. Arachnoid matter is a layer of fibrous tissue that is lying between the dura and the pia mater, and this arachnoid matter is separated from dura mater by subdural space and from pia mater by subarachnoid space, which contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So this arachnoid matter passes over convolutions of the brain and accompanies inner layer of dura mater in formation of falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. So the arachnoid matter continues downward to envelope the spinal cord and ends by merging with dura mater at the level of second sacral vertebra. This arachnoid membrane is also made up of simple squamous epithelium. The third layer of the meninges is the innermost meningeal layer called the pia mater, which is a very delicate membrane, and is a meningeal envelope that firmly adheres to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. As such, it follows all the minor contours of the brain, which are the gyri and the sulci, and is a very thin membrane composed of fibrous tissue covered on its outer surface by sheets of flat cells thought to be impermeable to fluid. So the pia mater is pierced by blood vessels, and its capillaries are responsible for nourishing the brain. Also, pia mater is a merge of collagen and elastic fibers, and they are bound to the underlying neural tissues. So these are the three layers of the meninges that cover the brain and the spinal cord, which are the dura, arachnoid, and the pia. So the dura is the outermost layer, the arachnoid is the middle layer, and the pia mater is the innermost layer of the meninges. So this is the picture showing the three meningeal layers that we have that covers the brain and the spinal cord. So looking at this picture, the first layer of the meninges is the dura mater, and we said that this dura mater is also made of two layers, which are the periosteal layer or outer layer that lies closest to the skull, and the inner or meningeal layer that lie closer to the brain. And between the dura mater and outer layer of the dura and the inner layer of the dura, we have this dura sinus in between them, that is the first layer. So the second layer of the meninges is the arachnoid mater. But before the arachnoid, there is a space between the dura and the arachnoid called the subdural space. As you can see from the diagram, is the one that is next after the inner layer of the dura mater. So that subdural space is the space between the dura and the arachnoid mater. So we now have the arachnoid mater that is found below the dura mater. After the arachnoid mater, there is also a space between the arachnoid and the pia mater, which is called the subarachnoid space, before we now have the final third meningeal layer, which is called the pia mater. So now we'll be discussing, after we have discussed the meninges that cover the brain and the spinal cord, we now start by discussing the brain, anatomy of the brain, and look at the several principal structures of the brain, the regions of the brain, and their specific functions. So the first one we'll be looking at, we have to first look at the brain itself. Brain is the center and complex organ of nervous system, and they are located or enclosed in a cranium that is within the cranial cavity. The weight of the brain constitutes about 1/58 of body weight at about 1.2 to 1.4 kg, and the brain is made up of mainly neurons, and there are more than 1,000 million neurons in the brain, and which means it makes the brain to contain almost 97% of the body neural tissue. And all these neurons, they form the gray matter, which lies in the outer region, and white matter that lies in the inner region of the brain. The region of the brain has three regions, which are the forebrain, midbrain, or hindbrain. And based on their embryology origin, the forebrain, also known as prosencephalon, and they consist of cerebrum in bracket called telencephalon, and diencephalon in bracket thalamus and hypothalamus. The midbrain is also known as mesencephalon, and we have the hindbrain, which is the opencephalon, that is made up of metencephalon, which includes the pons and cerebellum, and myelencephalon, which is also called the medulla oblongata. So the three regions of the brain are forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. But the forebrain gives rise to cerebrum and diencephalon. We have the midbrain on its own to make three, And the hindbrain is divided into three. We have the pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. So we are going to look at three uh these three regions of the brain was and their the all the structure that comes from the regions. So forebrain has two, cerebellum and the encephalon. Midbrain is one, which is still the midbrain, and the uh, hindbrain is made up of three, which is pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. So the first part of the brain we are going to be discussing is the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, and it occupies the anterior and middle cranial fossa. The cerebrum has two hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere, which is divided into these two by longitudinal cerebral features. And each of these hemispheres contain one of the lateral ventricles. Deep within the brain the hemispheres are connected by a mass of white matter called corpus callosum. And the cerebrum has a superficial gray matter, which is called the neural cortex, and a deep white matter. And this corpus callosum that is found deep within the hemisphere of the cerebrum, that is called the corpus callosum, is made up of band of 200 million neurons that connects the right and left hemisphere. So this is the picture of a brain that shows us the cerebrum. So this is the sphere view you are looking at is showing us the cerebrum of a brain, and we have the longitudinal feature that divide the brain into right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. So deep to this hemisphere is where we have a mass of white matter called the corpus callosum, which will be shown the other diagram that will be used to explain this cerebrum. So this is the sagittal section through the brain that is showing us the internal structure of each of one hemisphere. We have the first thing we are going to see here is the corpus callosum that I said is found within the hemisphere, which are connected by a mass of white matter that contain a mass of white matter. And this hemisphere is one that connects the two right and left hemisphere together. So that is the corpus callosum. And the next thing is the lobes of the cerebrum. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes, and these lobes takes the names of the bones of the cranium. The first one is the frontal lobe, the second one is the parietal lobe, temporal, and the occipital lobe. So from the superior view, we have the frontal lobe, which is anteriorly, in which central sulcus separates it from parietal lobes. In lateral view, we have the frontal and parietal lobes separated from temporal lobe by lateral sulcus, and the posterior place occipital lobe are separated from parietal and temporal lobes by a plane of parieto-occipital sulcus that is visible on medial surface of the cerebrum in a hemisected brain. The anterior most point of anteriorly projecting frontal and temporal lobes are called the frontal and temporal poles, and the posterior most point of posteriorly projecting occipital lobe is called the occipital pole. So we have 4 lobes: the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, temporal, and occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe, when you are looking at the cerebrum from the superior view, you have the frontal lobe, which is projecting anteriorly and is separated from the parietal lobe by central sulcus. At the lateral view, the frontal and parietal lobe are separated from temporal lobe by lateral sulcus, and occipital lobe are separated from parietal and temporal by parieto-occipital sulcus. So that projecting part of the frontal lobe is called the frontal pole, and the projecting part of the temporal lobe is called the temporal pole, and the posteriorly projecting occipital lobe is called the occipital pole. This is a picture showing the lateral view of the brain, and the cerebrum, as we said earlier, it has four lobes. So the first lobe is the frontal lobe, and the anteriorly projecting part of this frontal lobe is called the frontal pole. Second lobe is the parietal lobe, and this frontal and parietal lobe are separated from each other by central sulcus. The next lobe we have is the temporal lobe. This temporal lobe are separated from frontal and parietal by the lateral sulcus. And the fourth lobe is the occipital lobe, and this occipital lobe are separated from parietal and temporal by parieto-occipital sulcus. So that occipital lobe, the posteriorly projecting part of it is called the occipital pole, and the temporal lobe, the anteriorly projecting part of that temporal lobe is called the temporal pole. So that means we have four lobes and three poles. So the four lobes are the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe, while the three poles are the frontal pole, temporal pole, and occipital pole. The functions of cerebrum. 1. Cerebrum is associated with the initiation and control of skeletal muscle movement. 2. Cerebrum is also associated with sensory perception, which include the perception of pain, temperature, touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell. And the cerebrum is also associated with mental activities involving memory, intelligence, sense of responsibility, thinking, reasoning, moral sense, and learning, and they are also attributed to higher centers. So this one is shown that cerebrum has the wide functions it performs in our body. Cerebrum, the structure of the cerebrum also shows that the cerebrum has a folds which are called convolutions or gyri, and the group between them are called the fissures or sulci. Gyri is plural, the singular is gyrus, and also sulci is plural, the singular is sulcus. So these foldings permits the presence of millions more neurons in the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex of an animal such as dog or cat does not have this extensive folding as we have it in man. And this difference in the foldings of the human brain enables us to read, speak, do, do long division of work, write poetry and songs, and do so many other human things that dogs and cats cannot do. So this picture is trying to show us the foldings that we have in the cerebrum. So all those foldings are called the gyrus, and you can see some other labelings there, which are the placental gyrus, the placentral gyrus. Those are the foldings that look like a ridges. They are the one that is called the uh gyrus on the cerebrum, and the line that separates or passes in between these foldings are the one we call the sulcus. And you see you have two sulcus in this labeling. We have the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus. Those are the line that is found in between the foldings. So we have the gyrus, these are the foldings, and the line that separate them as the sulcus. Some of the areas that you can find on the cerebral cortex, we have the sensory areas, which are, we have one, the postcentral gyrus or the parietal lobe that receives somatic sensory information for touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature. We have the primary sensory cortex also on the surface of the postcentral gyrus. We have the special sensory cortices. We have the visual cortex on the cerebrum that receives information from sight receptors. We have the auditory cortex that receives information from sound receptors. We have the olfactory cortex that receives information from odor receptor, and we have the gustatory cortex that receives information from taste receptors. Those are the special sensory cortexes that can be found on the cerebral cortex. So this picture is showing us some of the areas or the cortex that are found in the cerebrum, and also we have the lobes also. So looking at the colors that are scattered around this cerebral cortex, you can see some of the labeling that are there. We have the parietal lobe, which is sky blue color. We have the central sulcus, which is a line that demarcates the parietal from the frontal lobe, and frontal lobe is at this region, which is at at the one arterially projecting part. We have the temporal lobe too. You can see the occipital lobe, and some of the cortex are seen there. Some of the sensory cortexes are there. We have the olfactory cortex. You can see where it is located, and the auditory cortex, you can see where it's located. So look at this picture very well. You'll be able to see some of the cortices that we have in the cerebrum and where they are located at each part of the brain. So the lobe of the brain will show you, be able to help us to locate the cords that are found around those lobes when you look at this and study these pictures very well. And also we have the hemispheric lateralization. This is the functional differences between the left and right hemisphere. You know that there are two hemispheres in the cerebrum. So each cerebral hemisphere performs certain functions that are not ordinarily performed by the opposite. So the left hemisphere in most people, the left brain, which is the dominant hemisphere, controls reading, writing, and math. Also control the decision making, speech, and language. While the right cerebral hemisphere relates to senses of touch, smell, sight, taste, and hearing. And also recognition is done by the faces and voice inflections. That is why in this context trying to show us that there is a hemisphere that is dominant in each individual. And one of the importance of this hemisphere is that due to the network of the neurons around this hemisphere, the left hemisphere control the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere control the left side of the body. So this is diagram showing the hemispheric lateralization. You see this diagram, we have the left hemisphere, but the nerve they cross before they leave. That's why we have the right hand being controlled by the left hemisphere, and we have the right hemisphere that is receiving signal from the left hand. That means the right hemisphere control the left side of the body, while the left hemisphere control the right side of the body. And the function each hemisphere is performing are listed on these pictures. The next part of the brain we'll be talking on is the diencephalon, which is located under the cerebrum and cerebellum near the midline of the brain above the midbrain, and it forms the central core of the brain. They link cerebrum with the brainstem, and they have three divisions, which are epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So this is the brain, and this part of the brain is showing us the diencephalon. The first part, this diencephalon, and the first part is the thalamus, and we have the hypothalamus, and we have the third part, which is the epithalamus. So look at this diagram where to see the location of the three part of the diencephalon. So the epithalamus is dorsal posterior portion of the diencephalon, and they comprise of trigonum alveoli, pineal body, and posterior commissure. But the functions of this epithalamus is one, the pineal gland, which is the one of the part of the epithalamus, helps in secretion of melatonin, and the epithalamus serve as a connection generally between the limbic system to other parts of the brain. Thalamus is the second part of the diencephalon, and thalamus is a midline paired symmetrical structure within the brain, and it's located between the cerebral cortex and midbrain, both in terms of location and neurological connections. The thalamus is superior to the hypothalamus and inferior to the cerebrum, and the third ventricle is a narrow cavity that passes through both the thalamus and hypothalamus. So some of the functions of the thalamus are one, they are concerned with sensation. Sensory impulses to the brain, except for those of sense of smell, follow neuron pathways that first enter the thalamus, which group the impulses before relaying them to the cerebrum, where sensations are felt. For example, holding a cup of hot coffee generates impulses for heat, touch, and texture, and the shape of cup, which is a muscle sense. But we do not experience this as separate sensation. So the uh, the thalamus are the one that integrate all the sensation and send them or relay them to the cerebrum. So when you hold a cup of hot coffee, the impulses generated is for heat, the touch, the texture, and the shape of that cup muscle, which pack together. But we didn't experience them separately, but as a mixed sensations. Also, the thalamus integrate the impulses from the cutaneous receptor and from the cerebellum, that is put them together in a sort of electrochemical package, so that the cerebrum fills the hole and is able to interpret the sensation quickly. Also, some sensations, especially unpleasant ones such as pain, are believed to be felt by the thalamus. However, the thalamus cannot localize the sensation, that is, it doesn't know where the painful sensation is. The sensory area of the cerebrum are required for localization and precise awareness. So, thalamus help us uh, to sense some unpleasant uh, feelings like a pain, but they can't localize the sensation. Another function is that thalamus help to suppress unimportant sensation. For example, if you are reading an enjoyable book, you may not notice someone coming into the room, but by temporarily blocking minor sensation, the thalamus permits the cerebrum to concentrate on important tasks. So part of the thalamus are also involved in alertness and awareness, which is being awake and knowing where we are, and others contribute to memory. For this function, as for others, the thalamus works very closely with the cerebrum. Hypothalamus is the last part of the diencephalon and it forms the ventral part of diencephalon. It's a portion of the brain that contains a number of small nuclei with variety of functions and located below the thalamus just above the brain stem. And this hypothalamus is the one that links the nervous system to the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. The function of hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, located superior to the pituitary gland and inferior to the thalamus, is a small area of brain with many diverse functions. Number one, hypothalamus helps in production of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These hormones are then stored in the posterior pituitary gland. And this ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, enables the kidney to reabsorb water back into the blood and thus helps maintain blood volume. While the oxytocin causes contraction of the uterus to bring about labor and delivery. The second function of hypothalamus is that they helps in production of releasing hormone, also called the releasing factor, that stimulate the secretion of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus produces, for example, growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete growth hormone. Another function of hypothalamus is that it helps in regulation of body temperature by promoting responses such as sweating in a warm environment or shivering in a cold environment. And number four, hypothalamus help in regulation of food intake. The hypothalamus is believed to respond to changes in blood nutrient levels, to chemicals secreted by fat cells, and to hormones secreted by the GIT. So, for example, during a meal, after a certain duration of digestion, the small intestine produces hormones that circulate to the hypothalamus and bring about a sensation of satiety or fullness, and we tend to stop eating. Number five is integration of the function of autonomic nervous system, which in turn regulates the activity of organs such as the heart, blood vessels, and intestine. So these are the functions of the hypothalamus. Also, among the other functions, we have the stimulation of visceral responses during emotional situation. How does hypothalamus stimulate physical responses during emotional situation? When we are angry, heart rate usually increases. So most of us, when embarrassed, we blush, which is vasodilation in the skin of the face. These responses are brought about by the autonomic nervous system when the hypothalamus perceives a change in emotional state. And the neurological basis of our emotion is not well understood, and the visceral responses to emotion are not something most of us can control. Also, hypothalamus help in regulation of body rhythm, such as secretion of hormones, sleep cycle, changes in mood or mental alertness. This is often referred to as our biological clock. The rhythm as circadian rhythms, meaning about a day. If you have ever had to stay awake for 24 hours, you know how disorienting it can be until hypothalamic biological clock has been reset. So, which means hypothalamus help us to control our biological clock, regulate it. So for you to, if you decide to stay awake for 24 hours, it will be very disorienting, because this will not be easier until when the hypothalamus are set back or reset our biological clock for us to be able to stay awake for that number of hours. After the hypothalamus, you now have the brainstem. The brainstem is one that processes information between spinal cord and cerebrum or cerebellum. And the brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. So the functions of the brainstem is that they provide the main motor and sensory innervation to the face and the neck via cranial nerves, and also plays an important role in regulation of cardiac and respiratory function. They also regulate the central nervous system and is pivotal in maintaining consciousness and regulating the sleep cycle. So this is a picture of the brain that is showing us the brainstem, which is the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. So these three structures form the brain stem. The midbrain, which is the first part of the brain stem, extends from the pons to the hypothalamus and encloses the cerebral aqueduct, which is a tunnel that connects the third and fourth ventricle. Several different kinds of reflexes are integrated in the midbrain, including visual and auditory reflexes. For example, if you see a wasp flying towards you, you automatically duck or twist away. This is a visual reflex, as is the coordinated movement of the eyeball. Turning your head to a sound is an example of auditory reflex. And the midbrain is also concerned with what we call righting reflexes, those that keep the head upright and maintain balance or equilibrium. And the midbrain has two pairs of sensory nuclei, which are the superior colliculus, which is for visual, and inferior colliculus, which is for auditory. And there are cerebral peduncles, which are nerve fiber bundles on ventrolateral surfaces that contain descending fibers to cerebellum and motor command fibers. So this is the picture showing us the brain, and this is the midbrain that is found between the cerebrum and the pons. So the next, pons is the second part of the brainstem and is located in front of cerebellum, inferior to the midbrain and superior to the medulla oblongata. And it consists of white matter that include tracts conducting signal from cerebrum to cerebellum and medulla, and tracts that carry sensory signal up into thalamus, and the gray matter lie deeply, which means the pons has a tract that connects out or transport signal, one from cerebrum to cerebellum medulla, and also carry signal into the thalamus. And the pons has a cerebellar peduncle that connects cerebellum to pons and midbrain. And also the pons link the cerebellum with mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, diencephalon, cerebrum, and spinal cord. And pons also has a sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8. The function of pons is that, one, it consists of nuclei that relay signal from cerebrum to cerebellum. also contain nuclei that deals primarily with sleep, respiration, swallowing, bladder control, and it also has a pneumothoracic center that regulates changes from inspiration to expiration. So this picture is also the picture of the brain, and this is where the pons is located, in front of cerebellum, below the membrane, and above the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is the last part of the brainstem, and it extends from the pons superiorly and is continuous with the spinal cord, and is about 2.5 cm long and lies just within the cranium. It has two surfaces, which is the anterior and posterior surfaces, and they are marked by central features, with white matter at the outer aspect, which passes between the brain and the spinal cord, and gray matter lies centrally. And medulla oblongata is the one that shows that it has the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. And this medulla oblongata allows brain and spinal cord to communicate. It coordinates the complexes and autonomic reflexes, control visceral functions, and there are nuclei in the medulla. We have the autonomic nuclei that control visceral activities. We have the sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerves around the medulla oblongata, and we have the relay stations along the sensory and motor pathways. So the medulla oblongata that extend from the spinal cord to the pons, and we also said it's anterior to the cerebellum, its function are those we think of as vital, as in vital signs. Some of the functions of the medulla oblongata are: 1. It contains cardiac center that regulate heart rate. It also contains vasomotor centers that regulate the diameter of blood vessels and thereby blood pressure. And also they have respiratory centers that regulate breathing. So there are three centers in the medulla. We have the cardiac center that regulates heart rate, vasomotor centers that regulate the diameter of blood vessels and blood pressure, and respiratory centers that regulate breathing. That is why when a crushing injury to the occipital bone, this injury may be fatal. That is why it cannot survive without the medulla. Also in the medulla are reflex center for coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. So this picture is also showing us the brain, and this is where the medulla oblongata is located. It continues superiorly from the pons and continuous with the spinal cord. Cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, oval in shape, and has two hemispheres separated by a narrow midline zone called the vermis. It is located below the pons and immediately below the posterior portion of cerebrum, and the cerebellum occupies the posterior cranial fossa. So this is the brain, and this is where the cerebellum is. That is direction the cerebellum found below the cerebrum, and it occupies the posterior cranial fossa. The cerebellum is separated from the medulla and pons by the fourth ventricle and is inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. As you already know, many of the functions of the cerebellum are concerned with movement. These include coordination, regulation of muscle tone, the appropriate trajectory and end point of movement, and maintenance of posture and equilibrium. Functions of cerebellum. Notice that these functions of cerebellum are all involuntary. That is, the cerebellum functions below the level of conscious thought. This is important to permit the conscious brain to work without being overburdened. If you decide to pick up a pencil, for example, the impulses for arm movement come from the cerebrum. The cerebrum then modifies these impulses so that your arm and finger movements are coordinated and you don't reach past the pencil. The cerebellum also seems to be involved in certain sensory functions. For example, if you close your eyes and someone places a tennis ball in one hand and a baseball in the other, could you tell which was which? Yes, certainly you could, by the feel of each, the texture and the weight or heft. If you pick up a plastic container of coffee with a lid on it, could you tell if the cup is full, half full, or empty? Again, you certainly could. Do you have to think about it? No. The cerebellum is in part responsible for this ability, and also it also functions to regulate equilibrium. The cerebellum and also the midbrain uses the information about gravity and movement provided by receptor in the inner ears. So these are the functions performed by the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum when it is cut in the sagittal section, and that is one of the hemisphere of the brain, of the cerebrum, sorry. So that is one of the cerebellar hemisphere, and we said the vermis is one that divide them into two hemisphere. So the ventricles of the brain, as we said that the cerebrum has two hemisphere, so each cerebral hemisphere contain one large left ventricle, and they are separated by a thin medial portion called the septum pellucidum. So there are four ventricles in the brain. We have two lateral ventricles, one in each of the cerebral hemisphere, and the third one is the third ventricle, which is the ventricle found in the diencephalon. And lateral ventricles communicate with this third ventricle through the interventricular foramen, also known as the foramen of Monro. And the fourth ventricle is the ventricle that extends into the medulla oblongata and connects with the third ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain. And this fourth ventricle continues as central canal in spinal cord. So this is the diagram or a picture showing us the ventricles of the brain. You have the first one, the lateral ventricles, which are two, and they are found in the two cerebral hemispheres. And the interventricular foramen is the point at which the lateral ventricle communicates with the third ventricle. And after the third ventricle, and this third ventricle is found in the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle is the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct of the midbrain, and this fourth ventricle is found at the medulla oblongata but continues as central canal in the spinal cord. So the fourth ventricle continues as central canal inside the spinal cord. So those are the four ventricles that we have in the brain. And the brain also have a cerebrospinal fluid, and this cerebrospinal fluid flows through the spaces that are found between the meninges. We have this, it flows through the subdural space, which is found between the arachnoid matter and dura mater, and also we have the subarachnoid space, which is found between the arachnoid matter and pia mater. And this arachnoid space is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and cerebrospinal fluid is one that carries the soft gases, nutrients, and waste that are found around the brain.